Hey everybody, it is Thorn taking a break from my work from home job. Very exciting. I'm coming to you from my home and not a parking lot, so good for me. I don't live in my car. Uh, right. Despite popular perception, perhaps. I wanted to make this video because I was on this week's Occultism with a Side of Salt podcast. I haven't listened to the edited podcast yet, and I actually recorded another version of this video a little bit earlier, but then I didn't post it, and then I deleted stuff from my phone, and anyway, here we are again. But there was one part of our conversation that after we got off the call, I was like, damn, I really wish I'd elaborated on that. So you don't have to have listened to the podcast. This is just kind of a related note that I thought folks might be interested in. And it is an issue that I think is important that we don't necessarily talk about a ton, at least maybe not in the best ways. So I thought, all right, here we go. And that is men, like dudes in the craft, and gender, and like I'm thinking about this because one of the most controversial things about traditional Wicca, initiatory, coven-based Wicca, even before we start talking about how gender is a spectrum and inclusivity, and like all of those things are true, and I think there are a lot of really good practitioners, coven leaders, writers, thinkers who are working really actively on making initiatory Wicca more inclusive, and addressing some of those things, right? Okay. But even before we get there, I think one of the big hesitancies that comes up when people consider initiatory Wicca as a potential path for themselves is this idea of sky-clad ritual. And it's because, like, when you get naked men and women in a room together, there are kind of these underlying assumptions that it must be sexual, there is space for sexual coercion. Like, that's a real concern. It's one of the first things that comes up when I engage with seekers to my own coven. People always come, whether they have personal hang-ups and experiences about nudity or not, people always come with questions about sky-clad ritual. And it's because, like, of course that triggers all kinds of anxieties. I think that's very natural. So in the podcast, particularly, it was a comment that Nike brought up about folks who have experience in abusive situations, have dealt with traumas kind of related to those issues in the past, like maybe these initiatory groups that practice skyclad aren't the best spaces for them. And I think that's true. Like, I think, or it can be true rather, when you're approaching any coven, whether it's a Wiccan group or not, whether it's an initiatory group, a traditional group, like whatever, anytime you're approaching another group of practitioners for training or camaraderie or fellowship or whatever, you have to ask yourself, is this the right group for me? And if the answer is no, that might be rooted in lots of different things. It could be a scheduling conflict. It could be a theological like there are all kinds of reasons why a group might not be suitable. And one of those is, of course, if they practice skyclad, particularly if it's mixed gender, like that's something that particularly women, right, are gonna like hit pause on. And I've witnessed this myself, and of course I've been in this situation myself. So I wanted to just kind of share some of my personal experiences. This is not, of course, like the definitive word on how like all groups operate or should operate. I mean, I hope that it goes without saying that your own boundaries are of the utmost concern here, and no group should ever put you in a position where you feel like you have to defend yourself, right, and your boundaries. If you find yourself in a space where you feel you're being coerced or pressured, whatever, like, as an autonomous adult, regardless of how much experience you have in the craft, regardless of your age, your gender, regardless of anything, like, you always have the authority to walk away, and a healthy group will affirm that for you. It's one of the reasons why the outer court period prior to initiation exists for so many groups and traditions. In my own coven, the outer court, kind of like there's an interview, like there's an outer court ritual structure that folks participate in all before initiation, because you have to get to know each other and establish that trust long before you're walking naked into somebody's magical space. I think that's a component that people miss. Like, there's this idea that, like, Gardnerians and Alexandrians are just sort of looping strangers in and, like, forcing them to participate in, really sensitive acts, like, right off the bat. And like, my group certainly doesn't operate that way. Neither do the other groups that we associate with. And if you find yourself in a position where you are being pressured in any way, like, please walk away. Like, nay, run away. So all of that said, what Nike had to say, I think, was absolutely true. Like, you have to know yourself. And if you have trauma, and not even just trauma, right? But if you have personal reservations, whatever the reason, like, that's a question that you get to ask yourself, and that's a choice that you can make. And for a lot of people, the answer is going to be, nope, I need a different sort of group. And that's fine, completely valid. For others, however, sky-clad practice, and practice, I think, in mixed-gendered spaces offers an opportunity in some cases to heal some of that trauma. And this isn't like a whole cloth endorsement, okay? But I thought it would be worthwhile to share some of my own experiences, given that I also have some trauma and some baggage kind of tied up in that stuff. And I won't go into any detail. I've been in therapy for a long time. I've been really open about that on my channel. So I'm sharing these things because I'm comfortable talking about it. So no need to, like, reach out to me for reassurance, or, right? Like, I'm good. I'm sharing these experiences with you because I hope that they're helpful. So me coming into an initiatory coven situation, I already had a lot of baggage around my relationship with men. I'd been in an abusive relationship for a number of years. I'd had manipulative relationships with, like, teachers and professors. Like, I've seen a lot of shit, kind of, like, as a woman in academic spaces, as a woman in magical spaces, as a woman who came up playing in bands, right? Like, I played in punk bands and I played in bar bands throughout my 20s. I was in the music scene, like, not, like, directly in the center of it, okay, but I was deep enough in it to have, like, seen some shit. So if you've been involved in music, if you've been involved in academia, which is a lot, like, it's got some of, like, the shittier aspects of the music culture, which is really strange. But if you've been involved in those spaces, you know that they can be dangerous for women sometimes. And you learn to kind of put up walls, and you have particular experiences that inform how you live the rest of your life. And some of those things I'm going to carry around with me for the rest of my life, kind of no matter how much therapy I have. So coming into a Gardnerian setting where I'm looking at sky-clad ritual, particularly with men for the first time, and yeah, that brought a lot of stuff up. But for me, in the long run, those things ended up being really positive, because in the coven that I was trained in many ways, these were some of the first relationships that I had as an adult with men that were actually really healthy. So being in that situation and kind of seeing that I could be in these spaces and have it not be sexual and not be coercive, and I could learn to appreciate my own body and my relationship with other people, I could do all of those things at once. That ended up being very healing for me. I think in a way that surprises people when they initially hear, like, oh, like, Gardnerians practice skyclad. Or, Wiccans as a whole practice skyclad or whatever. Because I don't want to overshadow that abuse absolutely happens. But it doesn't just happen in Wicca, right? it happens in academia, and it happens in rock music, and it happens in traditional witchcraft, and it happens in Christianity, right? Like, abuse is a thing that happens where people happen. And we need to be vigilant about those things. But I think it gets a little dangerous when we sort of peg like whole movements, like this is where the problem is. So if we just like cancel this religion, problem solved. And like that's not how it works. I think we all know that. But sometimes we're not super conscious of how that sort of plays out on social media. Like anytime you have people involved, those are things that you have to be vigilant of, and that's just sad and true. So having those positive experiences with men, I mean, my own high priest, and eventually my working partner, and the other men in my coven, which is not to say that like things are perfect all the time, but those experiences did a lot to help me to heal from those earlier experiences that I had, like in my early and mid-20s. And also the figure of the horned god. I think there's definitely a lot to criticize Wicca for in terms of like gender binaries and the conversation about polarity and how the gods are depicted. Like all of that critique is valid. So I'm just speaking for myself here. But coming in my 20s with the kinds of traumas that I had, having an explicitly having that horned god figure, and like this was a difficult thing for me, but building that relationship over time, kind of figuring out who he was, my relationship with him, gave me a model for masculinity and manhood that was very, very beneficial, very healing. That sounds cheesy when I say it out loud, but I just don't know how else to convey it to you. And I think a lot of women turn to the goddess for solace, right, in dealing with these kinds of things. And I did that too, to an extent. But to me, redefining my relationship with men and how I think about maleness and masculinity and what it means to be a man and kind of these broader questions about gender, that happened to me through my work with the god. And I think that is that's an experience that's out there. And it's not one that I've heard talked about very frequently. So I kind of just wanted to throw that hat in the ring. I think that as sensitive as these topics are, it's worth hearing a lot of voices and a lot of experiences, because I think sometimes people have these ideas that like, I don't know, like I think I kind of like our collective attitudes about gender, I think, are just always really problematic. Okay. But for me, practicing in a traditional group, working skyclad, working with particularly the god, was instrumental to my recovery. And I just wanted to throw that out there because I wish that I'd mentioned it in that podcast when we were talking about kind of like the pitfalls that come along with approaching groups that practice skyclad, particularly if you have trauma related to that. So anyway, I welcome other people's experiences. I know that this is a sensitive subject, and I probably didn't phrase things as well as I could have. But there is that. And I hope you are all well, and I will talk to you next time.